Hey guys, thanks for joining us this evening. Great to see you again, Joel. This evening I'm going to be chatting to a good dear friend of mine, Praveen Moman, who is the founder of Volcanoes Safaris. Let me see if I can get him on quickly. And a connection check a little earlier this afternoon because we've got some serious weather here in Cape Town. So I'm going to be chatting to Praveen, who I believe is all the way in the UK. Hi, Praveen.
Hi.
How are you doing this evening?
Sorry.
We'll let you get set up there. There we go. That's a little better. We won't have to suffer from vertigo.
Okay, here we are.
Good evening.
Hello, everybody.
How are you doing, Praveen? I've got you loud and clear. How's the connection? Can you hear me clearly?
I think so, yes. I'm just trying to settle down the position of the phone, but otherwise all seems okay.
All right, great. You're looking sharp, and I'm really looking forward to chatting with you. It's been some time since we've had a good conversation, you and I.
Yeah, it's about, I was just thinking today, it's about 15 months since we were in the field together. We were actually at Chambura doing filming together. So it's some time, and of course there's been dramatic changes in the world since then.
It really has. It's been something, we've really actually enjoyed, the opportunity to reach out to people like yourself, during this time. And it's been a nice way of us, I guess, reconnecting in a sense, because as Black Bean, we haven't been able to get into the field for a number of months. So we really appreciate you making the time and chatting to us this evening. For those of you who don't know, Praveen Moman is the founder of Volcanoes Safaris and operates lodges throughout Rwanda and Uganda. And we're going to be chatting to him a little bit this evening about great ape conservation and, just his journey that he's taken over the last 2 decades or so with regards to ecotourism in both Rwanda and Uganda. Praveen, I'm just really, really happy to chat to you today, and thanks again for making the time. I think it would be really nice if you could start off by giving us a little bit of a history. I managed to dig up 1 or 2 old photos. I hope you don't mind. I'm not trying to give your age away here, and kind of give us an idea of where it all started. I mean, I think you were about 12 years old in the 60s when Diane Fossey was just starting her research in Rwanda. Would love to hear a little bit more about how you ended up in a very remote part of Africa all those years back.
Thank you, James, and thank you everybody else who's on the chat tonight. It's of course my first live Instagram chat, which is already something that dinosaurs find difficult to do. So let's hope I survive that. It's a real pleasure to talk to people, especially at this difficult time. I think we all kind of had 3 months of really crazy stuff. And as you say, James, people like you and I who spend a good part of our lives actually in the field, in the wilderness areas of Africa, in kind of vanishing parts of the world, it's particularly challenging and stressful for us, I guess, because we spend, we still are field people as well as urban people, because that's how the world has made us what we are. As you say, I was born in Uganda, and at the age of 12, I went walking in what are called the Virunga volcanoes, which are on the border of Uganda, Rwanda, and the DRC. And I walked on the Ugandan side with my father. And the Virungas are spectacular, and I'm sure James' shots will show you some of these areas. And it was you never realize what a very changeable and complex time, because, of course, independence happened in the 60s, early 60s in Uganda. And there were many post-colonial changes, and eventually 10 years later, my family had to leave and become refugees to England. But that period between 1960 and 1970, in a way, changed my life, or shaped it in a very major way. Because my father, who came to East Africa from India in 1937, and worked most of his life in the civil service, first in the colonial civil service and then in the independent countries. And although that was his day job, his basic passion was wilderness and wildlife. So we grew up with the wilds of this part of Africa, which are some of the most exciting and most interesting and most unique, as a kind of normal thing in our backyard. And it's strange that, what you see when you're, between the age of, say, 8 and 16, and suddenly you lose all of that. You lose Africa. You kind of have to leave it, and you think it's a forgotten and a closed chapter. But for me, in the end, those childhood images, those childhood feelings, and the connection to this area remained very strong. And I suppose in a curious way, I imbibed my father's love of the wilderness and tried to do something about it in later life.
He was a role model to you, wasn't he, Praveen? I mean, you've often when we've had discussions, you've referred to your dad and how he's always I guess instilled a passion for both this area and the wilderness. He's pictured here, isn't he? That's your dad walking through. It looks like Virunga National Park or Volcanoes National Park.
It might be. I don't see the picture clearly enough, but certainly there are other pictures that you have. Yes, well, of course, like all of us, and I'm sure you've been through this, we have, yes, that's certainly my father on the right-hand side in that picture, in this family picture in the mid-60s. Like all of us, we have, let's say, changing and complex relationships with our parents. So there are moments when they're role models and moments when you think they're wonderful, and there are moments when they're less good. But certainly on the wilderness and on the issues of conservation and trying to appreciate what Africa had then and still has, I have to say it comes from him. And for him, it was an early obsession because last year I wrote up his short stories that he'd done over the period of his life. And he had been obsessed with wilderness and wild places since he was a child. And he wrote an essay, a kind of, when he was reflecting on when he walked through the woodland near his village in Punjab. And it was called In Search of the Zakira, In Search of the Wilderness. So yes, in this, it's something that I guess both my father imbibed, and it was, of course, a period where those of us who were privileged, those of us who had access to these things, you took it as granted. It was a kind of whole interest in wilderness, wasn't there, and wildlife. But again, it was for privileged people, I have to say. It was for people who were middle class, who were largely white and Indian in those days. And you just thought, you just were so lucky to be able to appreciate it.
And what was it like in those days? I've obviously only been afforded the opportunity to travel to East Africa in more recent times. Going back to your childhood, obviously, times were rather turbulent. What was living in Uganda like, for you and your family?
Well, for those of us who were born in Africa in that changing period of the empire coming to a close in the early 60s, the different nations of Africa becoming independent and the post-colonial realities, it was obviously very changing and complex. Because, of course, the African states that exist today and existed in the 60s are states created in the 1884 Berlin Conference, as you know. And so they have, let's say, questionable validity, which exists today, but how they were carved up, who are the people in it, remain challenges. So that was one issue. And then in post-colonial times, there's an issue when the imperial power goes, who is to take over the country? And inevitably there's jockeying for power from different ethnic groups, from different interest groups. Should you be a left-wing government? Should you be a right-wing government? What should you do with these people who are in your country, such as the Indians and Europeans, who of course had a big influence and a big economic hold on the country? So in some ways it was an idyllic childhood, and it was a kind of toy town Disney world of these small towns and villages, these wonderful landscapes, and you didn't have money, you were not wealthy, but you had a good life and you could just live in this simple way. And by and large, the racial tensions were very minimal in Uganda. In other countries, of course, they varied. But in Uganda, generally racial issues were good. Post-independence, of course, there was a concern about how to make Africans progress further. So my father, for example, lost his job in the civil service, which at the time was very difficult for the family. But I think it was important to make the change. And anyway, he found other jobs and whatever. So it was a time of big change, and we didn't really know where we were going as people born in the country and having had families there for 100 years, whether we would be able to stay or go. And in the end, of course, by 1972, Amin didn't give us the choice. He said to everybody, basically, it's time, your time's up. Off you go in 3 months. So
wow.
That was kind of the closing part of it. And obviously we had difficulties with that and challenges. But what was really sad is then what happened to the African population. And then that took many years to stabilize, from Amin coming to power in 1970 and until 1986. The country remained very unstable and really had huge suffering, which was terrible to see.
For those of you who have just joined us, I'm chatting to Praveen Moman, who in many ways pioneered great ape ecotourism in both Uganda and Rwanda. And Praveen, maybe we can start, talking to that a little bit as well. Sadly, obviously, you and your family were forcefully moved out of Uganda, but you ended up back in Africa many years later. What inspired you to come back to Africa and essentially set up a model, which I'm sure in those days, based on the back of a lot of issues, specifically with both Uganda, with post Idi Amin's reign, as well as the genocide in Rwanda. What inspired you to come back to Africa, and what were the initial steps you took to start pioneering this ecotourism model in these countries?
Well, it was a combination of different things. One was that having come to the UK in 1970, by the early 1980s, I was working for the European Union and working on Africa. And at the time, especially on South Africa and apartheid issues. So I started going to South Africa in those difficult times, which you know better than I do what South Africa was going through. And that reconnected me back to Africa quite quickly. So on these political visits to Southern Africa and then to Kenya and places like that, it suddenly got me, gave me this connection again. And so very early on, in 1982, I went back to Uganda to have a look at it. And of course, it was still a very unstable country and not a very safe country. So the few days I was there, I had to have an escort to move around. And it basically confirmed at the time that Africa for us was closed. So that was my reaction after my first visit in 1982. But every few years, I would go back. I would want to see what's happening in East Africa, and especially Uganda. And you could travel more, you could, explore the country more. It was stabilizing, it was getting safe again, and you saw how wonderful it was. And then there was a terrible blip, if you like, that happened in 1994, as you know, the Rwandese genocide. And although that happened next door in Rwanda, it kind of made me really, unsettled and upset about it. I mean, many of us were, but having seen what happened to our families, then seeing what happened to people in that epoch, how the Africans from different communities were having a difficult time, it kind of pulled me back. So I wanted to go back again. And in 1995, I went. And that actually, in a curious way, 1 year after the genocide, I went to southern Uganda, which was full of refugees, full of instability, full of soldiers of different armies and militias. So it was a very unsettling and difficult period, but somehow it was the deciding period for me to think, actually, I want to restart working on tourism here. The potential of the Albertine Rift that runs between Uganda, Rwanda, and the DRC, as you know, and we've traveled it together, is huge. And one day this will settle. So I need to start working on this. So in 1997, after I'd finished my political job in London, I decided I would make a go of it. It wasn't the ideal time, let's say, 3 years after a genocide, where hundreds of thousands of people, as you know, had been killed and affected. And also it set off the Great Lakes conflict that went on for several years. So I kind of walked into the aftermath of all this, and it was far more challenging and unpredictable and complex than an idiot like me had realized. You assume the Rwandese genocide was on the Rwandese side and Uganda was safe and stable. But it wasn't. As I said, the whole Great Lakes area, all the half a dozen countries in the area kind of erupted as new tectonic plates moved and the countries starting having new conflicts. But nevertheless, we persevered. And finally, by about 2000, 2001, Rwanda started stabilizing. And that's when we became the first company really in the world to start taking clients. They're the first international company. So that encouraged us. And we had to work with the governments, with the military, with the diplomats to try and see which were the safe passages, when could you do this. And so you had to learn a lot of things that weren't kind of, in a textbook.
And then, what was the differences? What was that like in terms of those, guerrilla experiences? There's probably some people on, watching this now that have actually done it, a guerrilla trek. Then there would be probably a lot more risk involved, and like you say, you would have to have a security escort. What was it like with regards to the wildlife experiences during those days when you first started operating?
On the Ugandan side, by and large, in Bwindi, in the park in southern Uganda, and in Mugahinga, in the Virungas, it had stabilized and it was fine. On the Rwandese side, in the early days, it was still changeable. So every day you had to work with the military. You had to have an escort from the nearest town to the park, which then was called Ruhengeri, and now is called Musanze, as many of you will know. And you had to wait in the morning outside the mayor's office, by and large, every day in the pouring rain, as far as I can remember, while somebody would come along and do the basic paperwork of giving you a gorilla permit. And that seems very straightforward, but it's not very easy in a post-conflict situation where offices were not working, where there's barely a desk and barely somebody with a pen, and he's got to get things going, you've got to give him money, the transaction is slow. And then you had to wait for the army escort to take you up to the park. And then you had to wait again to make sure the park had been cleared for the day's gorilla trek. So it had its moments. But generally, it worked really well, and we would only take people in when we had the all clear that everything was okay that day. Some days we were told we could not go in, and that was that.
And in terms of people visiting both Rwanda and Uganda in those days when you first started up, just post the genocide, what kind of numbers were we looking at? I mean, it was obviously something that was quite new. What was how many people were actually traveling to these countries to go have a look at and experience the Great Ape experience?
On the Rwandese side, it was a trickle.
Yeah.
The number of guerrilla groups was a handful. Initially, I think there were four or five guerrilla groups, so there were less than 40 permits available a day. And by and large, you'd have anything from 5 to 15 people in the early couple of years. On the Ugandan side, it began to be a steady flow. You had 3 guerrilla groups in Bwindi and 1 in Gahinga. And by and large, you'd have 50% occupancy in those in the high seasons and less elsewhere. So Rwanda was slow to start, inevitably, because of what had happened. But once it began to settle down, and once people heard that it was working well, and the government was in control of the park and was very determined to make tourism work, actually word spread quite quickly, quicker than I'd imagined. And that's partly because, of course, the long link Rwanda had with the work of Dian Fossey, who, as you know, I first heard about when I was a child in the 60s, and then she stayed mostly on the Rwandese side, working there for about 20 years. And she had a long connection with National Geographic, and through that with the US. So all those connections made the chat of the world realize that Rwanda was opening up, and people started coming.
So she was absolutely instrumental. But what a lot of people don't realize is, what were her thoughts with regards to developing an ecotourism model? I mean, she had been working with these gorillas, I think, since the 60s. She died in 85. What were her thoughts with regards to bringing in tourists to actually introduce them to specifically habituated groups of gorilla?
As you know, she became very, very close to the gorillas. They were like her own family. And she was a very unusual and a very brave and a very special individual, to basically camp at the Karisoke Center that she built at 9,000 feet, for 20 years almost, in the cold and the rain and the mist, was very challenging. She had pneumonia, she would be sick, she would have issues of, stability, as we would all do if you were working in those areas. And the gorillas became very important to her. So she wanted really nobody else to be involved. And she, in the end, as you know, had difficult relations with local people as well, because she was concerned that they would be poaching. And that built up certain animosity. And when it came to tourism, she was also not very keen on it initially. In the end, she was persuaded in the mid-80s, just before she died, that tourism should start. And she was concerned that tourism would end up destroying the gorillas. I think what I would say, having worked for 20 years now in the different gorilla parks with our lodges and working with the ecotourism philosophy we've had, too much tourism, uncontrolled tourism, insensitive tourism, I think will destroy the gorillas. So she's absolutely right. And the reason for that is there's very few of them left. There's just over 1,060 between Uganda and Rwanda. And they are, of course, endangered. And they could disappear any time. And the diseases that we have, they can easily catch from us.
Yes.
On the other hand, if you have no tourism, this is my experience and my view, I don't think the gorillas would have a strong chance of surviving. They survive today because they have an economic value to the people around them. And that's again coming back to what I talked about earlier as privileged people. We go and see the gorillas because we can afford it. It's $1,500 in Rwanda and $700 in Uganda. Okay, it seems a lot of money, but many of us can afford it, certainly middle-class people. And even if you're a student or a young person, it's something you can save up for because it's a once-in-a-lifetime experience. But local people, of course, don't have the money. So they don't have any intrinsic interest in the gorilla. What they have interest in is land. Can they have land for cultivation? Can they have money to survive? Can their children have a better education? Can they have health facilities? So actually the gorilla model, if worked well, is one of the best sensitive, low-impact ecotourism models in the world. So there's about 100 people who can go in on the Rwanda side and about 150 on the Uganda side. So unlike many tourism destinations where you can have tens of thousands of people go in a day, this is highly controlled. And that's why I think tourism can and should work. And then you should follow the protocols. You need to be 7 meters away at least from the gorilla, which is not easy, as you've seen yourself, because when you walk into the forest, you don't know quite when you'll find the gorillas, and you don't know how many you'll see. If it's a group of 30, they don't line up in front of you, as you know, and say, here we are. You see one here, one in a tree, and infant somewhere else. And they're scrabbling around, they're moving around, they're having their endless feeding sessions. And before you know it, you put your hand behind you, and there's a baby gorilla that's taken your hand. And you didn't even know it was there. So it's challenging to keep the 7 meters distance, but generally the rangers are quite good, so that when they see a gorilla or an infant approaching, they push it away. So in summary, I would say tourism needs to continue, but very rigorously controlled. And also I would just say that it needs to build in a strong benefit to the communities.
Yeah, I think as an outsider, it's been amazing to watch how quickly Rwanda specifically has become such a sought-after country to visit, specifically with regards to, I guess, the ecotourism model. And I think what I've again noticed as an outsider is the government seems to be on board with regards to, the regulations that they enforce, and also really prioritizing conservation with regards to, working with communities, but at the same time, capitalizing on what is a natural resource and something that obviously contributes to, to the economy. In your opinion, why has Rwanda become, such a popular tourist destination? I mean, it's always obviously attracted people from all over the world, but it really has felt like over the last 3 years or so, we've seen a lot more international travelers coming into Rwanda. And I think this is for a number of reasons. It's not just to track the mountain gorilla. Rwanda has so much on offer. What would you say makes Rwanda such an attractive destination?
I think it's the dramatic change in Rwanda in the last 25 years. We all have some memory of the genocide and how terrible that was and what that did to the country. But even 5 years later, it was barely stable, barely functioning. It had been a conflict zone. It was a major task for the government to try and stabilize the country with all the rebel groups that were working in and around Rwanda, generally in neighboring countries. And it took some time to do that. So if you'd asked me in 2000, I first went there in 1998. And if you'd asked me in 1998 or 2000, do you think, in 2020, this country will be fully stable and working and everything would be fine, and it would make the dramatic economic progress it has done with 8% growth most years, and the standard of living improving steadily and health and education? I would have been very skeptical. But they have had a very strong vision and a very strong administrative structure to deliver that. So I think that's what's made the change in terms of the country working. There are, of course, huge challenges. It remains a poor country. There are challenges of how you achieve reconciliation between different groups, how you govern in those circumstances. And the political issues are big, which we don't get involved in. But overall, the change in, say, in Kigali and how it functions as a city, how it has a modern airport, how it is receptive to the needs of the international traveler, how gorilla tracking works well, how the park works well, I think has been a very important example throughout Africa of what can be achieved. And not only for gorillas. In eastern Rwanda, there was a park called Akagera, a third of which had to be cut off after the genocide. And it wasn't working when I first went there in 2000. And actually, it looked as if it one day might just become a cattle park. And today, as you'll know, it's been managed by African Parks Foundation for the last 10 years. And it's turned itself around. And had it not been for COVID this year, the park would have been self-sufficient. So these models of trying to advance the country, of trying to have an airline, of trying to connect it to the world, it has been one of the fastest turnarounds in the world of a country coming out of conflict. So it's obviously got a negative history, which people many years ago were afraid of. I think now they have understood it's very safe and stable. It's one of the safest countries in Africa. And there's a curiosity to see the rebuilding of it. And the government marketing and presence in the world, I think, helps. And these issues like the gorillas, the Akagera National Park, Nyungwe in southern Rwanda, make it an attractive country for people to visit in a very straightforward, easy way. It's a small country with a lot of charming and different attractions.
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, again, a lot of people don't realize it's, the most densely populated country in Africa. And as you say, it's a very small country. And what amazes me is that it's just got so much on offer. So, you've got obviously the cultural experience, you've got the history, which is obviously very hard to digest, but still, interesting to learn about. You've got Nyungwe in the south where you can, track chimpanzees. You've got Akagera Savannah Park in the east. So, it's become almost a one-stop shop in terms of really getting an amazing cultural and wildlife fix while on safari. Mm-hmm. But I guess the biggest attraction has always been the mountain gorillas. And, for me, people often ask, what is it like to experience the mountain gorillas in their natural habitat? And, I remember the first thing that stood out for me was, coming into Musanze and seeing firstly how their habitat had been encroached on by human settlements and how literally their habitat had been pushed right up to the Virunga volcanoes. But the actual and as you say, thanks to conservation, their numbers are on the increase, and they've been listed as endangered. They were once critically endangered, but the experience of actually tracking a mountain gorilla has to be one of the most intimate wildlife experiences one can have, in my opinion. And I shared an experience with you which I really enjoyed, and one of the reasons why I enjoyed it was actually.
What secret experience are you about to reveal to everybody?
No, it wasn't a secret experience. I'm going to play a video for you. Can you see the video?
Yes.
So, again, being able to, I guess, intrude, in a family group of gorillas for an hour is a kind of a difficult experience to explain to someone if you haven't experienced it. But what was so great in that particular clip that I just played now was also just seeing how much you enjoyed, spending time with these animals, because you've lived and you've grown up here. But it was really great to see how you still, after all these years, had such an appreciation for these animals, and we're almost like a little kid in a candy store in terms of how you received the experience.
I'll take that as a compliment.
It is a compliment, but what would you say, Praveen, in your words, makes this experience so unique with regards to specifically tracking mountain gorillas in their natural environment?
Well, I'm sure the group we're having this shared conversation with have traveled a lot and visited many areas. So it's always challenging to say why something is better than another, and each of us has our own views and, of course, our own connections. For me, like you say, it's a childhood connection. And I think, number one, the landscape is very special. The Virungas are particularly magical. And when you're walking in the Virunga forest or in the Bwindi forest, it's wonderful to have this mixture of Afro-montane and equatorial forests. So that already is breathtaking, and it's a very easy forest. It doesn't have bugs. It's not too humid. It's not too hot. Sometimes it can be a bit more rainy and humid than you might want. So you're walking through this forest, and you're just kind of, slowly discovering the forest and having kind of a wander. And then finally you come across this marooned gorilla family, so to speak. And then from the first time you see it to this clip you're showing now, it always seems like you're watching, I was going to use the word people. You're watching animals or / people, whatever you want to call them, that you're related to. And of course, 98% of the DNA we have is related to these gorillas. So every time you go, every day is different. The weather is different. The light is different. The gorilla mood is different. Last time I went in February last year with a friend, the gorillas in Gahinga, which is a very lovely, tiny part of the Ugandan side of the volcanoes. There's one gorilla family. They spent the whole hour playing with each other. So Mama gorilla would, clobber baby gorilla, and baby gorilla would roll around and go and beat his little kid sister up and whatever. So it's a very, it sounds banal to say engaging, but it's a very capturing. You're captivated by this. And of course, they're as curious about you as you're as curious about them. And they're watching you, and they're studying you and working out the connection as well. So I think, to me, it still remains one of the most special experiences you can have in the world.
I was going to say I completely agree, and I can so relate to what you're saying as well. And it's almost as if when you do look into the eyes of a gorilla, they're processing the fact that you're there, and you feel like you are interacting with an intelligent being. I don't know if you remember this. You were talking about sometimes you can't, sometimes the gorillas approach you, and you can't, get away from them. And I remember one gorilla approaching me once and actually looking at its reflection in my lens, which was absolutely amazing, and is a moment that will stay with me for a long time. Here's another image of, you were talking about how human-like they are. There's an image of a gorilla's hand on its foot. and every experience is different, isn't it, Praveen? This is a young gorilla suckling on its mom, and obviously a silverback over here. I'm just going through photographs for some folk who haven't had this experience before, because, as you say, it is one of the most unique wildlife experiences one can have. And also, most people don't realize that the mountain gorillas, as you alluded to earlier, there's a small population of them, just over 1,000, but they split into two habitats, aren't they?
Yes, basically they only exist on the border of Rwanda, Uganda, and the DRC. So they exist in the 3 national parks of the Virungas in Uganda, Rwanda, and DRC. And then there's a separate population in Gwindi, which is also a mountain gorilla. I'm not a gorilla taxonomist, but sometimes there's a debate exactly what sort of subspecies they are, how they're related. But it is a mountain gorilla, which looks slightly different to the Virunga gorilla. And if you are interested in gorillas, it's good to, if you have the time and of course the money, to go and see the gorillas in 2 or 3 parks, because the parks are different and the gorilla experience is different.
Yeah, I completely agree. And so often, that first experience that you have, it goes by so quickly, and you kind of get caught up in the moment. So, an hour is almost not enough. And at the same time, you've got different families you can be introduced to. These families obviously are made up of different individuals. So no gorilla experience is the same. I've just pulled up an image from here, from actually your property, Praveen. This is Virunga Lodge, looking onto the Virunga Mountains. So we're looking kind of northwest here in Rwanda onto the Virunga volcanoes. And this gives you also a good idea of how urban people have actually pushed up right against the gorilla habitat. So you've got people farming right up to the slopes of these volcanoes where these gorillas live. What is government doing in Rwanda with regards to expanding? There was talks of expanding the Volcanoes National Park at one stage.
Well, the habitats are tiny, and I wonder if people understand how tiny they are. The Virunga volcanoes on the 3 sides and Gwindi collectively are 700 square meters. To put that in context, Serengeti is 30,000 square kilometers. And the Yellowstone is 70,000, and the Alps are 300,000. So the actual habitat of the mountain gorilla is one of the smallest of any species in the world. And as you said before, it's the park is surrounded by the most densely populated area of Africa. There's often 600 to 700 people per square kilometer, and they go right up to the park. It's a very fertile area, and people can farm it. There has been a project by the Rwandese government that started discussing it a couple of years ago about how to expand this, how to expand the park on the Rwandese side, which has a very thin sliver, because curiously it was cut in the 1970s to increase the planting of pyrethrum. So that's a long-term aim, and I hope it'll happen. They're certainly working on it, but it needs compensation of several hundred families, so it'll have to be worked through.
Praveen, you obviously operate out of Uganda as well, and I know Uganda is very close to your heart. And for those of you, or for those of us who are thinking of traveling to Uganda, I think we often think of Gwindi. We think of Queen Elizabeth National Park and its tree climbing lions. But there's a very, very special, almost hidden gem within the savannas of Queen Elizabeth. And I'm referring to Chambora Gorge, where we've got another family of grape ape, the chimpanzee. I wondered if you wouldn't mind chatting a little bit about this hidden gem and the history of Chambora Gorge, and I'll also try and see if I can play a little video so we can get an idea of what this place looks like, just so that our audience can have an idea of just the atmosphere of the forest. I'm just going to let it play once more.
Of course. Thank you, James. I mean, like we discussed earlier, the Great Western Rift Valley, or the Albertine Rift, which goes all the way from the Red Sea down to Zambia, has some of the greatest treasures in the world. And every 100 miles or so, the ecosystem changes, and you find some dramatic savanna with its wildlife population. You find the Rwenzori Mountains, you find the Virungas, you find Windi. And Queen Elizabeth National Park is one of Africa's most significant parks. It was made into a park in the 1950s. The Queen was an early visitor, hence it was called that. And she happened to go, I think, when I was a few months old. Not that I would personally remember it. And it's a park with many different habitats within it. It's not very large, and I think that's one of the issues that perhaps we might discuss today, where some of the southern African wilderness areas, or Tanzania and Kenya wilderness areas, have major space. In Uganda and Rwanda, we don't. We have tiny parks that are left, surrounded by these populations, and that's a major challenge now. What will happen to a park like Queen Elizabeth? So that has its savanna, which you can go and do a wildlife safari, and as you said, go and see tea-cramming lions. You can also go to the Kazinga Channel and do a launch trip like you would have done in the 1950s to see all the hippos and elephants by the channel having their daily swim. But what is interesting about Chambura Gorge, it's about 13 kilometers. It's a sunken forest which leads into the Kazinga Channel, and it's got this community of chimps, which was about 15 chimps 25 years ago, and now it's up to 28 chimps. So it's a very fragile number. It's increasing slightly, as we see. Well, it's doubled in those years, but it's still a precarious number. And it's somewhere that I've known the general area from a very long time, and the lodge that I decided to build in Queen Elizabeth is on the border of the Chambura Gorge, just outside the park. So that has started on a major journey. Just like in Virunga, I picked a site that you showed, which showed the whole of the Virunga landscape. And of course, that was the first lodge we built in Rwanda after the war. Here, we picked a site that looks into the Queen Elizabeth National Park and the Chambura Gorge. So on the one side, we have a lodge. On another side, we reclaimed a wetland that was an illegal brickworks. On another side, we've created a community center and this 3-kilometer buffer zone on the northern side of the gorge to protect the chimps. So this has become our largest project. We're not a huge company, but this has become quite a huge project for us, where you take on different parts of land and you, in consultation and discussion with communities, see how you create buffer zones. Because one of the issues, of course, of African parks, which is a regular issue, is animal-human conflict. And it's easy for us to focus on the animals, but for the people who live on the edge of national parks, it's a major challenge. Because when the animals come out, they obviously intrude in their lives, they eat their crops, they can be aggressive. So that's what we've tried to do in Chambura, create, in the part that is not a national park, create a distinct buffer zone to protect it and also to separate the human population further. And the gorge itself, as you've shown in these pictures, is again, I don't know where these habitats, how they get created, why they're like that. They're so special. It's a sunken forest, 13 kilometers. You have a river in it and this chimp community, and sometimes, of course, lions and buffalo and hippo and elephants. And again, it's a magic lost universe.
Yeah, I guess as an outsider, again, visiting it for the first time was, it was really mind-blowing, for lack of a better word, because, as you described it earlier, it's set in the middle of an open savanna, and all of a sudden you come to this depression, and you actually track down into a gorge where there's obviously the most unbelievable bird life, there's wildlife, and of course this lost group of chimpanzees. And I think a lot of people associate chimpanzee tracking with Kibale Forest, and obviously it's an amazing experience to spend time with chimps at Kibale. But these chimps are special. They've, in a way, got a rather sad story in that they've been cut off from the rest of the population in the surrounding forest and are, in a sense, marooned within this gorge. How did that happen? And is there anything that you guys are doing in terms of trying to protect this family of chimpanzees?
The chimps are a very close species to man as well, as you know, to humankind, and also share about 98% of DNA with us. They're very different from gorillas. Gorillas are very peaceable, very quiet, predominantly vegetarians, non-aggressive, and very easy to deal with, and very sedentary. Sorry, I have charging issues to deal with. Whereas the chimps are the reverse. They are very aggressive, very territorial. They are highly skilled at looking after their territory and keeping out people. And they're very agile and mobile. To see chimps is very much harder than gorillas. So they often seem to be secondary from a tourist perspective. But actually, the whole charm of them is it's very different from a gorilla. And one other thing I would say is actually it's an interesting time that we're talking, because next month is what is called Gombe 60. It's the 60th anniversary of Jane Goodall's work in Gombe Stream in Tanzania. So just like Dian Fossey gave 20 years of her life, and then sadly she was killed, of course, Jane Goodall has given her life to the chimps. And as you know, has become a champion, not only of chimpanzees, but wildlife, and also about the balance in the planet, which she talks regularly about missing. So this chimp community, until 20 or 30 years ago, would have been connected to other forests. There's a couple of forests up the road, where the forest cover would have been enough. There would have been interchange with the population. They would have been able to breed and, not be isolated. Now, with human habitation around, that's not possible. There is a forest within the national park, about 13 kilometers away, called Maramagambo. So it's a much bigger project than we can do ourselves, but it's something we have been exploring with the Uganda Wildlife Authority, which is, of course, responsible for this area, and other NGOs like the Jane Goodall Institute and others, to see, can we plant a corridor? When I say we, all the stakeholders, to connect forests. Otherwise, the future of this community is questionable. Either at some point they will die out, or the inbreeding will get too much. So it's one of these issues that needs addressing.
And I think also people don't realize just what an amazing experience it is to track chimpanzees. Again, it's very similar to a gorilla tracking exercise, but at the same time, it's very different. As you alluded to earlier, they're quite mobile. They're incredibly vocal, and for me, actually, even more intimidating than spending time with gorillas on foot. I'm going to play a short clip, if you don't mind, Praveen. Often you hear chimps, vocalizing, either using, beating against buttress roots, or actually vocalizing from a distance away, and it's quite something to hear, especially when you're walking along a depression in the middle of Queen Elizabeth National Park. So I'm just going to see if this clip. So I guess the reason for me just playing that is just how incredible this experience is. And again, I guess it's through ecotourism, and it's through people who are interested in wildlife and these type of wildlife experiences, who help fund certain conservation efforts, like expanding this corridor in Chambura. I just want to encourage people, if you are thinking about, spending money and time on doing a great ape safari, it's definitely worth including spending time with chimpanzees. It's an unbelievable experience, and a very different experience to that of the mountain gorilla. And obviously there are a lot of other primates, and Praveen, as you alluded to earlier, Queen Elizabeth National Park has a lot on offer as well. But Praveen, how can people help with regards to this project that you've just mentioned, with regards to creating a corridor for these lost chimpanzees?
Well, I mean, the world has many projects going on, especially now when things are so challenging. But certainly, what we have been trying to do, Volcanoes Safaris is a private company, but we also have a charity registered in Uganda called the Volcanoes Safaris Partnership Project. Partnership Trust, sorry. And if you go to the Volcanoes website, on the community page, there's a link to all our work that we do at different lodges, including a donation link through PayPal. So if people want to support that, of course, they're welcome to do that. But it's something, we, as a private sector company, don't work in a big aggressive fundraising way. We do our work, and if people want to support it, then of course we're very happy and encourage that, and that's the way to do. That's the way to support it. And the challenges are many. To buy a piece of land, even in the middle of Africa, can cost several $1,000s per acre. And there's all the other safeguarding activities and community projects that we do, such as a coffee cooperative that we run with the local women, such as the training we do for young people in hospitality, and the tree planting. So there are different levels of things that people can do to support us, and we of course welcome and appreciate that.
And Praveen, someone who's worked with you in the past, I know you're not only passionate about tourism and passionate about these wild spaces, but you're a people's person, and you're passionate about people, and you've always instilled in me just how important it is to combine conservation with communities. How have you managed that in East Africa? We're running out of time here. We've got a couple more minutes. I'll let this be the last question, and there's one or two questions that come through that maybe we can address, Praveen, if there's time. Okay. But again, how have you managed to incorporate communities within this area?
It is exactly that. The central message should be that tourism cannot be done in isolation, nor can conservation. Conservation and tourism should work in concert with the needs of the communities. The communities need to have a stake in this. They need to be the guardians of these areas. They need to have an economic livelihood and bread on the plate. If they don't, we're going nowhere. And the focus of these discussions can be on the animals, but it's the communities that matter. And as you'll know, at our lodge in Gahinga, which you can see on the website, we did a project with the indigenous people, the Batwa, who were thrown out of the forest in 1991 without any land and without any rights. And a couple of years ago, we set up a scheme where they could have land and build their own homes. Otherwise, they were destitute and not going anywhere. So I think the central message at the end of this should be exactly that these are the local people there, these are the guardians of the earth and have been there for centuries. We need to make sure that they are part of this picture, and they are part of, so to speak, of the value chain. The animal cannot be more important than humans, as sometimes happens. And all our efforts should go to making sure that this works in a joint way.
I couldn't agree more, and I take my hat off to you, Praveen, in having the opportunity to see how you've engaged with communities in areas in areas of operation. So that's always been very encouraging for us to see. There's one or two questions that have come through. We're running out of time here, sadly. There are lots of people that say hi, by the way. There are a couple
yes,
of,
I see that.
Yeah, a couple
hi, everybody.
Of employees
yes.
that work for Volcanoes as well. There's a question that comes from Mexico City. How COVID affects gorillas? Obviously, I guess with regards to contamination, or gorillas actually catching it from people. What's the story in Uganda and Rwanda with regards to ecotourism? currently?
I think it's a serious concern and something we must all look at because, like we discussed before, the DNA of the humans and chimps and gorillas is very close. They can get our diseases, which is why you have all these protocols to keep them away. The International Union of Conservation, IUCN, whatever that stands for, I've forgotten what it stands for, has guidelines on how to deal with this. And we must make sure they're implemented. So the protocols of how far away you should be, wearing a mask, not go there if you're ill yourself, and be very, very careful how you interact, are thought to be sufficient. But it's something we'll have to do very carefully, the conservation organization and the tourism players, to make sure that with the government we implement whatever guidelines are required.
Jill has a question. Jill is actually coming to spend some time with the gorillas next year, which you're absolutely going to love. But her question is more to do with the chimpanzees, introducing other individual chimpanzees into the community, which might help, I guess, with regards to mitigating inbreeding. Is this an option, or is this too short term, in your opinion?
This has been discussed. We're, of course, not chimp behavior experts, but sometimes some of the experts, and as we see with recent things like COVID, there are experts and experts who have many different views. Introducing new animals into a community sometimes doesn't work out terribly well because conflict builds up, especially as chimps are so territorial. So I think it would have to be studied carefully by experts. It certainly is an option.
Praveen, I think I'm going to leave it there. I just want to, personally thank you for your time. It's been nice catching up with an old friend, and I also just want to direct all of you who are listening to my Instagram page as well. In the bio, we've put a link to the VSPT page on the Volcanoes website, which is all the community work they do. So if you would like to go have a look and find out more about what Volcanoes does with the local communities and the projects they're involved in, please do go take a look. And yeah, again, Praveen, thanks so much for your time. It's
Thank you, James. It's been an absolute pleasure connecting to everybody. But I, of course, I haven't connected to them directly, but one day perhaps we'll see them at our lodges. Thank you again.
Yes, and look forward to seeing you soon in person.
Yeah, that'd be great. Take care.
All right, all the best.
All the best. Take care.
Cheers. Thanks for tuning in, guys.